When the will was read, I sat there in silence as my brother, Brandon Carter, inherited everything: our parents' house, their fortune, their company. I got nothing. Not a cent. Not even a keepsake. But while Brandon basked in his victory, he had no idea that his perfect world was built on a lie. And worse? I had just found the proof to destroy him. He thought I'd walk away quietly. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The church was silent except for the priest's solemn words, but I barely heard them. My hands were clasped together in my lap, my gaze fixed on the polished mahogany coffin at the altar. My mother was inside, a woman I had spent my entire life trying to impress. And in the end, she had made it painfully clear that I had never been enough. Beside me, my brother Brandon let out a soft, pitiful sigh, dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. Always the performer. Even here, at our mother's funeral, he made sure the attention was on him. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his Rolex glinting under the dim church lights, he played the grieving son beautifully. If I didn't know him, I might have believed it. But I did know him. I knew exactly what kind of man he was. After the service, the family gathered in the lawyer's office. The air was heavy with expectation, but I already knew what was coming. I had told myself I wouldn't care. That I was prepared. I wasn't. Mr. Reynolds, our parents' attorney, adjusted his glasses as he read the will. "Nathan, I'm sorry," he said, flipping through the papers. "Your parents have left everything to Brandon." A cold, numb sensation spread through me. "Everything?" My voice was calm, almost too steady. "Yes." He hesitated before adding, "They believed you were independent enough and didn't need financial support. Brandon, on the other hand, required the assistance more." Brandon, the same man who drove luxury cars, lived in a penthouse, and had never worked a hard day in his life. And me? I had put myself through college, worked 2 jobs, built my career without ever asking them for help. "That's ridiculous," my Aunt Vivian muttered, breaking the tense silence. But Brandon didn't look surprised. He let out a soft sigh, placing a hand on mine like he was offering comfort. "Nate, it's not personal," he murmured. "Mom and Dad just wanted to help me." I pulled my hand away. "You knew, didn't you?" My voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Brandon's jaw tightened. Then, just for a second, he hesitated long enough for me to know the truth. He didn't just know. He had planned this. I wanted to yell, to rage, to demand how even after their deaths, our parents had found a way to remind me I wasn't good enough. But anger wouldn't change anything. I had learned that a long time ago. So instead I smiled. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Reynolds," I said smoothly, standing up. "I won't be contesting the will." Brandon's brows furrowed. "Wait, you're not mad." I looked at him for a long moment, then tilted my head and leaned in slightly. "Oh, Brandon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't need their money." His shoulders relaxed. He mistook my words for surrender. That was his first mistake. I turned on my heel and walked out of that office with my head held high. What Brandon didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I had already found something. A secret buried deep within our parents' past. A secret that would change everything. Brandon thought he had one. He had no idea what was coming. Brandon thought the conversation ended when I walked out of that office. He thought I had accepted my fate, that I would slink away quietly while he enjoyed the life he had stolen. He was wrong. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word from the reading of the will. It wasn't just the betrayal that ate at me, it was the certainty in Brandon's voice. He hadn't been surprised. He hadn't even tried to hide it. That meant only one thing: he had planned this. But how far had he gone? I needed answers. I drove to our parents' house, no, Brandon's house now, but it still smelled the same. Freshly cut grass. The faint trace of my mother's lavender perfume lingering in the walls. But this wasn't home. Not anymore. Brandon wasn't there. Probably out celebrating his victory. That worked in my favor. I made my way to my father's old study, a room we had rarely been allowed into as kids. It was exactly as I remembered: mahogany bookshelves, a heavy oak desk, and the faint scent of cigar smoke that never quite faded. I ran my fingers along the desk, pulling open drawers, flipping through old documents and ledgers. My parents had always been meticulous with their records. And then, beneath a stack of old insurance papers, I found it. An older copy of the will. I flipped to the first page, scanning the lines with growing disbelief. My parents had originally split the estate evenly between Brandon and me. My heart pounded. Brandon had done more than just accept their favoritism, he had changed the will. A slow, bitter smile spread across my face. There it was. Proof that his golden boy act was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. You weren't supposed to see that. I turned sharply. Brandon stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You knew I'd come here, I said, my grip tightening on the papers. He sighed dramatically, stepping inside, the overhead light casting sharp shadows across his face. Nathan, let's not make this a thing. Mom and Dad always intended for me to have everything. I just made sure their wishes were properly carried out. You forged legal documents, I shot back. He tilted his head. Can you prove that? I stared at him, waiting for a flicker of regret, of hesitation. Anything that might indicate he felt even the smallest ounce of guilt. But there was nothing. Just cold, calculated arrogance. I exhaled slowly, then smiled. Thanks for your honesty, I said. That's all I needed to know. And with that, I walked past him, out of the study, out of the house. But this wasn't over. I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I was going to make him regret ever thinking he could steal from me. This was war. Before I share how I systematically dismantled my brother's perfect life, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they could get away with it? Drop your stories in the comments below. And if you believe in karma, smash that like button, because what happens next is a masterclass in payback. Stay tuned. Brandon thought he had won the final battle, but what he failed to realize was that the war had only just begun. The thing about people like him, the ones who have always had everything handed to them, is that they never prepare for the moment when it all comes crashing down. I was going to make sure his fall was spectacular. I spent the next week gathering every piece of information I could on my brother. Not the surface-level details everyone already knew, the lavish lifestyle, the designer suits, the expensive vacations. No, I was looking for the cracks beneath the perfection. And it didn't take long to find them. Brandon had been drowning in debt for years. It turned out that behind the image of a successful businessman, he was nothing more than a reckless gambler, both in casinos and in business. He had made a series of bad investments, borrowed money from the wrong people, and was now barely keeping his head above water. The only thing that had saved him from total collapse was the inheritance. The inheritance he stole. And now I was going to take it away. The first move was simple. I sent anonymous tips to a few of his key business partners, carefully attaching copies of financial records that exposed his debts. At first, it was a slow burn, subtle doubts, whispered conversations behind closed doors. But then, one by one, they began pulling out of deals, distancing themselves, leaving Brandon stranded. I expected him to fight back, to try and recover, but arrogance had made him sloppy. He had built his empire on smoke and mirrors, and now that the illusion was breaking, there was nothing left to hold it together. And then I went for the personal blow. Melissa, Brandon's wife, had always been just another accessory in his carefully curated life. A trophy to display at galas and charity events, someone to smile at in photos while he carried on behind her back. But what Brandon didn't know was that I had been doing some digging. A few years ago, he had taken a trip to Europe, an exclusive getaway to Italy. A business retreat, according to him. The problem? Melissa hadn't gone with him, but someone else had. I scrolled through old social media posts, digging through tags and comments, and then I found him. Daniel Whitmore, Brandon's old college friend. A name I wouldn't have thought twice about if it weren't for the flirtatious messages buried in the depths of their conversations. The inside jokes, the late-night, miss you comments. And then the confirmation, a photo, buried in Daniel's old posts. Brandon and Daniel together in Italy, arms around each other, smiling. And the caption? A week I'll never forget. It didn't take a genius to read between the lines. Brandon had spent years crafting the image of the perfect family man, the devoted husband. But the truth was far messier. And now his truth was about to come crashing down. I didn't send the evidence to Melissa directly. That would have been too easy. Instead, I let it spread. A quiet whisper here, a forwarded message there. The right people always knew how to make gossip travel at the speed of light. And sure enough, within days, Melissa confronted him. I wasn't there to witness the fight, but I didn't need to be. The outcome was written in the aftermath. Brandon was suddenly living in a hotel, his social media accounts wiped clean of any mention of his wife, and his once perfect life now unraveling in real time. He had lost his wife. His business was crumbling. And for the first time in his life, Brandon Carter had no control. But I wasn't finished yet. Brandon had spent his entire life taking things from me. Now I was going to take everything from him. And next, I was coming for the house. Brandon had lost his business, his reputation, and his marriage. But there was still one thing left. The house. Our parents' house. The place where I had spent years feeling like a stranger. The place where every memory was soaked in the bitter taste of favoritism. The place that Brandon had stolen, believing I would never fight back. It was time to take it from him. With the original will in my possession and enough evidence to prove that Brandon had tampered with the final version, I filed a case with my lawyer. It wasn't a long battle, the law was on my side, and Brandon had no real way to contest it. The court ruled in my favor. Our parents' original wishes were reinstated. Half of everything, including the house, now legally belonged to me. Brandon was silent the day the sheriff arrived with the eviction notice. He stood in the doorway, his once pristine suit now slightly wrinkled, his expression unreadable. "You can't do this," he muttered, gripping the doorframe as if he could keep the house through sheer willpower. I smiled, stepping past him into the grand foyer. "Not anymore, Brandon. You took everything from me. Now, I'm just taking back what was mine." He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Where am I supposed to go?" I tilted my head, pretending to think. Then, with the sweetest smile I could muster, I handed him one last parting gift. An old, used bicycle. The same kind our parents had given me for my 16th birthday while he got a brand new car. "Guess you'll have to be independent now." I walked back inside and shut the door behind me, leaving him standing there alone. For the first time in his life, Brandon had no one to fall back on. But something strange happened as I stood in the house I had just reclaimed. I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No sense of victory. Just emptiness. Because this house had never been a home to me. It had been a battleground. A symbol of everything I had once wanted and never received. And now that it was mine, I realized I didn't want it at all. So, the next morning I put it up for sale. Not for profit. Not for revenge. But for closure. Brandon, meanwhile, was spiraling. His business was gone. His marriage was over. His reputation was in shambles. And for the first time, he had to live with the consequences of his own actions. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, struggling to rebuild a life without the safety net he had always relied on. And me? I was free. The money from the estate, I donated most of it. Not out of spite, but because I had built my life without it. I didn't need their wealth to define me. A week before I left town, Aunt Vivian invited me over for dinner. She had been the only one in the family who had truly stood by me, and as we sat at the table, she reached for my hand. "You know," she said softly, "your parents were wrong about you." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She smiled. "They always thought you were the one who didn't need them, that you were too strong, too independent. But the truth is, they needed you. They built their entire world around Brandon because he needed to be propped up. He needed their validation, their money, their constant approval. But you thrived despite them. And that scared them." The words settled deep inside me. Maybe she was right. Maybe my parents hadn't ignored me because I wasn't good enough. Maybe they had ignored me because they knew I didn't need them the way Brandon did. And for the first time, that thought didn't hurt. That night, as I packed the last of my things, I took one final look around my old room. The boy who had lived there, the one who had spent years trying to prove he was worthy, was gone. In his place was a man who had nothing left to prove. I picked up my bags, walked out the door, and never looked back. Because my past didn't define me. My future did. At its core, this story isn't just about revenge. It's about self-worth, resilience, and the power of breaking free from the past. Nathan spent years trying to earn love and recognition from a family that never saw his value. But in the end, he realized something far more important. He didn't need their validation to prove his worth. He didn't need their money, their approval, or their name to build a life of his own. Brandon's downfall wasn't just about karma. It was the natural consequence of entitlement, greed, and arrogance. He believed he was untouchable, that his manipulation would go unnoticed, that his brother would always remain in his shadow. But the truth always finds a way to come out, and when it did, it shattered the illusion he had built his entire life around. So, what do you think? Did Nathan do the right thing by taking back what was his? Or should he have walked away without looking back? Drop a 2 in the comments if you love the story, or a 7 if you think it should have ended differently. And if you believe in justice, standing up for yourself, and never letting anyone erase your worth, then hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe to Mr. HeartVibes for more gripping stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.